Only people that I know who aren't are people who are unhappy in life and been a big disappointment to them.
At the height of his fame, Dan Blocker was living the dream. He had it all. Most actors spend their whole careers chasing stability, respect, and that one role that cements their name forever. For Blocker, that role came easy, which made the way it all ended hit even harder. There were no warning signs, no dark clouds hanging over him, no moment that hinted at heartbreak ahead. Everything seemed steady, like life would just roll on as usual. But it didn't. What came next was sudden, shocking, and left a hole that time never managed to fill. The silence that followed his loss grew louder with every passing year, echoing through Hollywood like a ghost story no one wanted to tell. Dolphia Blocker, his wife, could have become the face of public mourning, the woman everyone turned to for answers, for closure. But she did something totally unexpected. She vanished from the spotlight. Her refusal to feed into Hollywood's appetite for drama turned their final chapter into one of its quietest, most heartbreaking mysteries. Dan had come from humble beginnings, a big-hearted man, raised tough but never bitter. On Bonanza, Little Joe might have been the charmer with his good looks and jokes, but it was Hoss who truly stole hearts. That shy, gentle giant with a goofy grin and a heart too big for his chest. People loved him instantly because what you saw on screen wasn't an act. It was Dan himself. He entered the world already larger than life, born December 10th, destined to leave a mark too deep to ever fade. Back in 1928, in the small town of DeKalb, Texas, Dan Blocker came into the world already making headlines. He weighed a jaw-dropping 14 pounds. Even now, he still holds the record as the biggest baby ever born in Bowie County. From day one, his life sounded like something straight out of a legend, a story people couldn't stop talking about, and that storytelling never stopped following him. When Dan was still young, his parents, Ora Shack Blocker and Mary Arizona Blocker, packed up what little they had and moved the family to O'Donnell, a tiny town about 40 miles south of Lubbock. Shack had been a farmer, but when the Great Depression wiped out everything he owned, he refused to quit. He scraped together enough cash to open a small grocery store. The family lived right behind it, cramped in a few back rooms, while Dan helped wherever he could, hauling groceries, stocking shelves, and running bags out to customers' cars with that big, friendly grin. Shack would joke with buddies that he should pay people to hire Dan because the boy was so massive he kept breaking things in the shop. But no one back then realized that Dan's size, the very thing that caused all those clumsy accidents, would one day be his greatest gift. O'Donnell was a speck of a town, just 800 folks surrounded by endless Texas ranch land. But on Saturday nights, the whole place came alive. And the main attraction, Dan himself. Word got around that if anyone thought they were tough, they could prove it right there on Main Street. They'd rope off a section, crowds would gather, and Dan would take on anyone daring enough to step forward. And according to Dan Blocker himself, he never lost a single fight. Even as a teen, Dan Blocker was built like a tank, around 275 pounds of pure power, and he knew exactly what he could do with it. He once bragged he could take on heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson himself. All he needed was a few months to train and drop some pounds. That wasn't just empty talk either. Dan had the muscle and mindset to back it up. At just 13, he joined the Texas Military Institute, where he smashed his way onto the football team as a linebacker. His size and strength made him a natural beast on the field. Before long, he earned a scholarship to Sul Ross State University, planning to study English while keeping his football career rolling. By 18, he was a towering 6'3" and nearly 300 pounds. And believe it or not, he kept growing. But then fate threw him a wild curveball. The university's drama club needed someone big enough to move heavy stage props for their play Arsenic and Old Lace. Dan was the obvious choice, strong, reliable, and always willing to lend a hand. But during rehearsals, someone suggested he jump into a small role, Teddy Brewster, the loud, eccentric nephew in the story's wild family. The moment he stepped on stage, everything changed. The lights, the laughter, the crowd's energy, it hit him like lightning. He felt alive in a whole new way. That rush was addictive, and from that night on, Dan was hooked on performing. Without hesitation, he switched his major from English to theater, ready to chase a dream he didn't even know was waiting for him. When graduation came, offers from pro football teams rolled in. But Dan shocked everyone. He turned them all down. Instead, he packed his bags and headed east, chasing a brand new dream that would soon make him a legend. Dan Blocker hustled his way through summer stock shows and repertory theater, grinding it out night after night until he finally landed a small but proud role on Broadway in King Lear. It wasn't fame yet, but it was proof that all his hard work was paying off. The stage lights were calling, but fate had other plans waiting just around the corner. In late 1950, everything changed when Dan got drafted into the U.S. Army during the Korean War. Suddenly, the man built for Hollywood found himself in combat boots. He went through brutal basic training at Fort Polk, Louisiana, then spent 9 months in Sapporo, Japan, toughening up even more. From there, he shipped out to Korea, assigned to Company F, 2nd Battalion, 179th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Infantry Division, a unit that would see some of the fiercest battles of the war. By the end of his service, Dan had climbed to the rank of sergeant. His unit was stationed near the Jamestown line close to Chorwon, what's now part of North Korea. In March, things got real at a hotspot known as Outpost Erie. The fighting there was intense, but what came next was straight out of a war movie. On May 25th, while on patrol deep behind enemy lines, Dan's group walked right into an ambush. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped, but surrender wasn't an option. When one of his fellow soldiers was hit and left stranded under heavy fire, Dan refused to back down. For over 4 relentless hours, he held his ground, firing back at machine guns, mortars, and enemy rifles roaring from every direction. Even though the wounded man didn't make it, Dan's bravery held the enemy off long enough to protect his team. And the battle didn't end there, not even close. From mid-June to the end of the month, his unit was thrown into non-stop clashes at Erie, Old Baldy, and Pork Chop Hill, before finally defending Hill 223. After 209 grueling days on the front lines, the 45th Infantry Division was finally pulled back in July. Dan Blocker walked away not just a soldier, but a survivor, hardened by war and forever changed by what he'd seen. While serving as first sergeant, Dan Blocker was wounded in combat and eventually hospitalized, injuries that nearly took him out for good. But even in the middle of chaos, he never lost his grit. His courage on the battlefield saved the lives of several men in his unit. In August 1952, the Army finally sent him home, but the stories of what he'd done out there followed him forever. One of his soldiers, Gordon Apts, later spoke about Sergeant Blocker with raw admiration. He remembered him as strong, athletic, and loud in the best way possible. A leader who could fire up a whole camp with just his laugh. Apts said Blocker could crush a beer can between 2 fingers and still make sure every man under his command had what they needed. That mix of toughness and heart made him unforgettable. That same year, Dan's life took a brighter turn. He married his sweetheart, Dolphia Parker. With a new wife by his side and a deep sense of purpose, Dan returned to college to finish what he'd started. He pushed through and earned his master's degree in dramatic arts. With twin daughters, Deborah Lee and Danilyn, and 2 sons, David and Dirk, the young father had mouths to feed and dreams to chase. He took a job teaching high school English and drama in Sonora, Texas, pouring his energy into shaping young minds. Later, he moved to New Mexico to teach 6th grade, each move carrying him further west, each job quietly steering him toward destiny. Dan wasn't chasing fame yet. He was just living steady, working hard, loving his family, and teaching with genuine joy. He had this calm energy, the kind that made people feel seen and inspired. You can almost picture him standing in front of a classroom full of life, showing students how to speak, perform, and dream big. Somewhere in those dusty school hallways, Hollywood's most misunderstood star was still finding his voice, one lesson at a time. Everyone who really knew Dan Blocker agreed on one thing: the man had a heart as big as his frame. Sure, he had a temper that could flare up in an instant, but just as quickly he'd cool down, own up, and apologize. That mix of fire and humility made people respect him even more. When Dan packed up his family and moved to California, it wasn't about chasing fame or soaking in Hollywood lights. Not at all. His plan was simple, grounded, and smart. He enrolled at UCLA to work toward a PhD in dramatic arts, all while continuing to teach. Acting was still something he enjoyed, but it wasn't the center of his world just yet. That started to shift in the mid-1950s when Dan began auditioning for TV roles, not because he was desperate for fame, but because he needed to bring in some extra cash for his growing family. Back then, Westerns dominated every screen, and Dan's sheer size, booming voice, and warm presence made him the perfect fit. One small part led to another, a bartender here, a brawler there, and before long, his face started popping up all over television. Then came a wild, almost moment. Stanley Kubrick himself tried to cast Dan in Dr. Strangelove. After Peter Sellers backed out of playing Major T.J. King Kong, Kubrick had his eyes on Blocker. But his agent turned the offer down, and the part eventually went to Slim Pickens. A total missed chance. One of those what-if moments that only make sense years later. In 1957, Dan scored a quirky little gig in a Three Stooges short called Outer Space Jitters, playing a creature called the Goon, credited as Don Blocker. That same year, he popped up as a bartender in Sheriff of Cochise. Something clicked right then and there. Being on set, slipping into new characters, hearing that action. It all reignited that fire he'd first felt back in college. The spark was back, and this time, there was no turning it off. After that, the roles started rolling in like wildfire. Dan's face began popping up all over TV, in hit shows like Gunsmoke, The Rifleman, Have Gun, Will Travel, and Maverick. In Maverick, he even got the chance to flex his natural comedic charm. Big guy, big laughs, and even bigger screen presence. He had this rare mix of power and warmth that made audiences light up every time he appeared. Then came 1958, a major turning point. Dan scored a guest spot on Walt Disney's Zorro, and not long after, he landed a regular role on a short-lived series called Cimarron City. The show didn't last long, and at the time, it probably felt like another dead end. But what Dan didn't realize was that its cancellation would become his biggest blessing yet. Because that open schedule, it made way for the role that would define his entire career. Producer David Dortort saw something special in him, that rare, down-to-earth authenticity, and cast him as Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza. From that moment on, everything changed. Dan hit pause on his PhD studies and threw himself into acting full-time. The role demanded every bit of heart, humor, and strength he had, and he gave it all. If Little Joe was the show's heartthrob, Hoss was its heartbeat, the gentle giant who kept the Cartwright family grounded. He was the emotional glue that made Bonanza more than just another Western. But here's the wild part. When Bonanza first aired, it wasn't a hit. Ratings were so low that NBC almost axed it after the very first season. The Saturday night time slot had it going head-to-head with Perry Mason, and Bonanza didn't even crack the top 30. Still, the network believed in it. They switched it to Sunday nights at 9 p.m., and just like that, everything clicked. The show exploded into one of TV's biggest hits, turning Dan Blocker into a legend almost overnight. The audience exploded, the ratings skyrocketed, and Bonanza turned into a full-blown TV powerhouse, a run that would stretch for an incredible 13 more seasons. With Chevrolet stepping in as a major sponsor, the show got an extra boost during season 2, cementing its place in living rooms across America. But believe it or not, Bonanza almost got shut down before it had the chance to shine. Behind the scenes, trouble was brewing. The show was expensive, too expensive for comfort. Executive Thomas Sarnoff later revealed that the New York network brass had secretly planned to cancel the series after just 13 episodes because production costs were spiraling out of control. Shooting in full color back then wasn't cheap. Bonanza cost around $105,000 per episode in its first year, an eye-popping figure for the late 50s. That's when Sarnoff stepped in like a hero behind the curtain. He promised he could keep the show on budget, and somehow he pulled it off. Thanks to that bold move, Bonanza survived and then blew up. It became one of the most adored and longest-running shows in TV history. And right at the heart of it all stood Dan Blocker's unforgettable Hoss Cartwright. From the very first moment America met Hoss, something just clicked. Here was this mountain of a man, 6'4", over 300 pounds, who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a Western myth. But instead of being a fierce outlaw or cold gunslinger, Hoss was gentle, goofy, and full of heart. He got tongue-tied around women, stumbled into messes, and wore every emotion on his sleeve. Audiences adored him instantly. There was this warmth in his eyes that made you root for him no matter what. Even his name, Hoss, came from a playful twist on horse, a folksy way of saying big guy. And for Dan Blocker, that nickname couldn't have been more perfect. What truly sealed the deal for fans everywhere was how completely Dan Blocker became Hoss Cartwright. To millions watching across the country, Hoss didn't feel like a TV character. He felt real. Viewers didn't see an actor reading lines. They saw a man they wished they could know in real life. But here's where the twist comes in. Behind the scenes, Dan Blocker was nothing like the slow, bumbling ranch hand he played on screen. In reality, Dan was a man of serious intellect and depth. He held a master's degree in theater, had worked as a schoolteacher before fame ever found him, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from discipline and study. He was thoughtful, deeply read, and rooted in his faith as a free Methodist. And when it came to politics, he surprised people. He leaned progressive, stood up for liberal causes, and even threw his support behind Eugene McCarthy. The real Dan Blocker wasn't some simple cowboy. He was sharp, reflective, and endlessly curious about the world around him. Yet despite all the differences between the actor and his character, there was one powerful thread that tied them together: compassion. Dan believed in kindness, fairness, and doing right by people, no matter who they were. That moral backbone shined through every scene he played. Kids picked up on it right away. They felt that Hoss was good through and through. Parents saw it too. Hoss never came off fake or polished. There were no hidden motives, no slick charm. What you saw was exactly what you got, a big-hearted man just trying to do right in a complicated world. But fame came with its own kind of weight. In the early seasons of Bonanza, Dan started to feel like he was disappearing into Hoss completely. He later admitted that, for a while, he couldn't even tell where he ended and Hoss began, as if the two of them had somehow become the same person. Dan Blocker poured everything he had into creating Hoss Cartwright, every thought, every habit, every emotion. He studied the character so deeply that over time, the lines between himself and Hoss started to blur. It wasn't until around the 5th season of Bonanza that Dan finally learned how to draw a line, how to step into Hoss every morning and step out of him every night. But even then, Hoss never completely left him. The character lived quietly inside him, like a soft echo that never faded away. Dan carried a powerful quote that guided both his personal life and his work. It came from 18th century Quaker missionary Stephen Grelle. "If there is any kindness to be shown or any good to be done, do it now, for we only pass this way once." That line became the emotional heartbeat of Hoss Cartwright. Every shy smile, every clumsy apology, every moment of pure loyalty, it all flowed from that simple belief in doing good while you can. Off camera, Dan's toughness showed up in ways that shocked people. During one intense filming day, He was thrown hard from a horse and cracked his collarbone. Most actors would have called it quits and gone straight to the hospital. Not Dan. He calmly set the bone himself right there on set, then climbed back onto the same horse and finished the scene like nothing happened. Only after wrapping did he finally take a break to recover. But life had its funny way of humbling him. During recovery, he put on some extra weight, and when he returned to filming, the very same horse that had thrown him couldn't carry him anymore. It was almost poetic, a reminder that even the strongest can be brought low by life's quirks. Through it all, Dan's quiet grit never faded. He didn't brag, didn't seek sympathy, and rarely spoke about his time as a decorated Korean War veteran. But those who knew him could tell. That unshakable calm, that quiet courage. It all came from a man who'd already seen the worst life could throw and still stood tall. The war left marks on Dan Blocker that never faded, deep ones that shaped the rest of his life. One of the biggest changes was his view on guns. Bonanza might have been built on shootouts, outlaw showdowns, and frontier justice, but behind the camera, Dan hated firearms. He said openly that while his character carried one on screen, in real life he wanted nothing to do with them. That feeling traced back to one horrifying night in Korea, sitting on a dark mountain, realizing just how helpless a person becomes when someone else is holding a weapon. That moment broke something inside him. Before the war, he'd enjoyed hunting. Afterward, he refused to touch a gun ever again. Dan wouldn't even allow his sons to go hunting. To him, shooting animals for sport just didn't make sense. He once said that unless animals could shoot back, calling it sport wasn't honest. His stance wasn't just moral, it was emotional, grounded in experience and empathy. He'd seen real violence, and he knew there was nothing glamorous about it. That made for an interesting contrast. On screen, Hoss Cartwright might have reached for his holster, but off-screen, the man behind him rejected violence completely. Dan believed strength came from compassion, not destruction. But amid all the gunfights and staged chaos, Dan found something rare in Hollywood: a true sense of family on the Bonanza set. He grew especially close to Lorne Greene, who played the wise patriarch Ben Cartwright, and to a young, fiery Michael Landon. Landon, though still early in his career, already had bold ideas about storytelling and direction, and Dan respected that drive. The three shared a brotherly bond that went far beyond the cameras. For Dan, Bonanza wasn't just a job. It was a home, filled with people who cared about each other as much as the characters they brought to life. Michael Landon had a fire in him. He could be stubborn, opinionated, and wasn't afraid to clash with producers or network execs when he believed in something. Some folks thought he was tough to deal with, but Dan Blocker saw right through that. He saw passion. Landon cared deeply about the show, its message, and its characters, and that intensity eventually helped shape Bonanza into something legendary. The cast practically lived together, long days that started before sunrise and stretched late into the night, 5 days a week. But what made them special was that, even after all those grueling hours, they still hung out together off set. That bond wasn't just for the cameras. It was real, genuine, and built on mutual respect. It ran so deep that when Michael Landon married Lynn No, Dan proudly stood by his side as best man. Even though Bonanza consumed most of his schedule, Dan still managed to squeeze in a few big screen moments. He showed up alongside none other than Frank Sinatra in Come Blow Your Horn, and again in Lady in Cement. But no matter how glamorous Hollywood got, television was always where he felt most at home, and Hoss Cartwright was his true legacy. Despite the fame, Dan never let success change who he was. He stayed humble, grounded, and loyal to his roots. He even moved his parents out to California so they could be close to him. But back in O'Donnell, Texas, the people never stopped claiming him as their own. Folks from his hometown loved to reminisce about that gentle, bookish kid who used to walk their dusty streets with his nose buried in a novel. Seeing that same boy riding across the Ponderosa every Sunday night on TV felt surreal. like watching one of their own conquer the world. In the end, Dan Blocker achieved something truly rare in Hollywood. He created a character that felt timeless. Hoss Cartwright wasn't just comic relief, and he wasn't just another sidekick. He stood as a symbol of kindness and decency in a world that could be rough and unforgiving. And behind that gentle giant stood Dan Blocker himself, a man who lived by the very values his character preached. A man who believed deeply in compassion because he understood pain. Dan Blocker was the rarest kind of star, the kind who chose gentleness over glamour. By the mid-1960s, he had reached the level of fame most actors could only dream of. Fans adored him, fellow actors respected him, and kids across America saw Hoss Cartwright as the kind of man they wanted to become someday. Yet in one of life's most poetic twists, the man behind the legend wanted almost nothing to do with fame. Dan loved the art of acting, the storytelling, the emotion, the teamwork, but the attention that came with it. He could have done without it. Stardom never interested him. He didn't care about red carpets, fancy parties, or being treated like royalty. What mattered to him was the work. He and his wife, Dolphia Parker, made a conscious decision to stay grounded. While other TV stars were out buying mansions in Beverly Hills and throwing glitzy Hollywood parties, the Blockers settled into a modest 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom home in Northridge, a quiet, down-to-earth suburb just 20 miles from Paramount Studios. Their house wasn't flashy, but it was warm, cozy, and filled with love, exactly the kind of life Dan wanted. To him, acting was a job, something he did because he enjoyed it and because it allowed him to take care of his family. He wasn't chasing celebrity status or trying to build some Hollywood empire. He just wanted to work honestly and go home at the end of the day to the people who really mattered. But as Bonanza's popularity exploded, the fame became impossible to ignore. Everywhere he went, people recognized him, shouting "Hoss" across streets and restaurants. The attention felt strange to him, even uncomfortable. Dan would sometimes laugh it off, but deep down, he never quite understood why millions of people were so moved by a cowboy he played on TV. The world saw a star, but Dan Blocker, he still saw himself as just a working man doing what he loved. Strangers stopped him everywhere, in restaurants, on sidewalks, even while he was out running errands. Some would grab his arm without warning. Others would pull him into hugs he never asked for, and almost everyone wanted an autograph. Most of them meant well, but Dan Blocker quietly struggled with all that unexpected closeness. He didn't like being touched by people he didn't know, not out of arrogance, but because he valued his space. Privacy mattered deeply to him, and once you lose it, you never really get it back. That was the part of fame he could never adjust to, how it crept into the small, sacred corners of family life. Dan and his wife Dolphia had 4 children, and all he wanted was for them to grow up normal. But that simple dream kept getting harder to hold on to. Even the most ordinary outings, like taking the kids out for ice cream, could turn into public scenes. Fans would gather around, kids would whisper, parents would point and say, "Look, it's Hoss from Bonanza." Conversations got cut short, moments got interrupted, and the quiet family time Dan longed for just faded away. He understood people's admiration, but that didn't make the reality any easier. Still, no matter how famous or exhausted he got, Dan never stopped showing up as a father. He was playful, loving, and full of life at home, exactly how fans imagined Hoss would be off-screen. Standing around 260 pounds, he used his size not to intimidate, but to make people laugh. After long days on set, he'd come barreling through the front door like a kid himself, pretending to muscle past his sons just to be the first one to reach their electric racetrack. The house would fill with laughter and shouts. That's who Dan Blocker really was, a big-hearted dad who'd trade all the fame in the world just to make his kids smile. It was goofy, it was childish, and it was pure Dan Blocker. That silly obsession with racing toy cars around the house said everything about who he really was, Beneath that massive frame and booming voice was a man who never lost his sense of play. Sure, he could be serious when life demanded it, but he knew the power of laughter, and he used it every chance he got. The Blocker household was the perfect mix of fun and grounded living. Yes, they had nice things, a swimming pool, a few good cars parked in the driveway. Parker cruised around in a sleek '63 Cadillac, and Dan proudly drove a brand new Corvette Stingray. But none of it was for show. There were no marble fountains, no gold gates, no red carpet extravagance. Their house wasn't built to impress Hollywood, it was built for family. And that down-to-earth energy showed in every part of their lives. Dan didn't surround himself with A-list stars or Hollywood power brokers. He stayed close to the people who really knew him. His circle was filled with old school teachers, longtime friends from Texas, and folks who remembered him not as Hoss Cartwright, but as the gentle, book-loving guy who used to haul groceries and crack jokes back home. He and Dolphia never cared about glitz or climbing social ladders. They skipped the big Hollywood parties, the networking dinners, and the endless parade of handshakes and fake smiles. That scene just wasn't for them. What they wanted was simple. Quiet evenings, familiar faces, and real conversations that actually mattered. Fame might have changed how the world saw Dan Blocker, but it never changed the man himself. He stayed humble, kind, and deeply loyal to the same values that had shaped him long before stardom ever knocked on his door. For all his success, Dan never forgot what mattered most: love, laughter, and staying true to who you are. Dan Blocker never tried to twist himself into Hollywood's mold. Instead, he quietly walked away from it. No gated estates, no secret mansion tucked in the hills. He wanted something real, something peaceful. So, in one of the boldest moves of his life, he packed up his family and left the U.S. behind, choosing to settle in a completely different country. Dan Blocker moved his entire family to Lugano, Switzerland, a decision that stunned everyone around him. And this move wasn't about money, business, or tax breaks. It came from something far simpler and way more poetic. One day, while flipping through National Geographic, Dan stumbled upon a feature about the breathtaking lake regions of northern Italy and southern Switzerland. Page after page of shimmering blue waters, towering mountains, and old-world villages stirred something deep inside him. It wasn't just admiration, it was longing. Dan had already traveled through Europe once before with his wife, Dolphia Parker. After seeing those photographs, he told her straight up that if they ever went back, they had to see that lake region for themselves. Years later, they did exactly that. In 1970, the Blocker family set off on a trip through Switzerland and northern Italy, exploring Lake Como, Lake Maggiore, and eventually the stunning town of Lugano. And somewhere along that journey, everything just clicked. Lugano wasn't just beautiful, it was perfect. A calm, sunlit town nestled between the mountains and the water. It carried an old-world charm that felt like it belonged to another time. Dan later said it was the most beautiful place he had ever seen. But what mattered more was how it felt. For the first time in years, he found what he'd been quietly craving: peace. No crowds, no flashing cameras, no strangers reaching out to grab his arm in grocery stores. Just stillness, family, and a chance to breathe. In Lugano, Dan Blocker didn't just find a new home, he found himself again. Lugano offered everything Dan Blocker had been searching for: quiet streets, crisp mountain air, and a slower, gentler pace of life. It was the kind of peace he hadn't felt in years, and everything about it just fit. The practical details came together almost effortlessly. The family found an American school in Lugano for the kids, who quickly started picking up new languages and adjusting to life abroad. Europe itself became their backyard, a world of history, culture, and beauty just a short train ride away. By 1970, the decision was final. The Blockers were officially starting a brand new chapter in Switzerland. Of course, Dan still had big commitments waiting for him back in the States. Bonanza was one of the most successful shows in television history, and he took that responsibility seriously. But he had a simple plan. Every time filming wrapped, he'd hop on a plane and head straight back to Lugano to be with his family. To him, the move wasn't about running away. It was about preserving the life that really mattered. The spotlight could stay in Hollywood. What Dan wanted was balance. Time to breathe, time to just be. Of course, the rumor mill couldn't stay quiet for long. People started whispering that he'd moved to Europe for money reasons, dodging taxes, chasing investments, hiding secret deals. But Dan shut all that down fast. He didn't owe anyone an explanation, but he made it clear none of that was true. If anything, the move actually cost him more. Higher taxes, travel expenses, and the headache of managing dual citizenship. But that never bothered him, because money had never been his motivator. What drew him in was simple: peace, privacy, and the freedom to walk down the street without strangers stopping him every 5 steps. And there was one small, almost funny bonus that made life even sweeter. In Switzerland, hardly anyone recognized him. Hoss Cartwright might have been a legend in America, but in Lugano, Dan Blocker finally got to be just another friendly face enjoying a quiet day by the lake. Bonanza did air on Swiss television, but only dubbed in German. And in southern Switzerland, where Italian was the main language, hardly anyone tuned in. That meant something rare and wonderful for Dan Blocker. In Lugano, he wasn't Hoss Cartwright anymore. He was just Dan. No fame, no flashbulbs, no autograph lines, just a man living his life in peace. That anonymity was worth more to him than any Hollywood paycheck. Like fellow Western legend James Arness from Gunsmoke, Blocker had never been comfortable with celebrity culture. He didn't crave premieres or red carpets, didn't chase headlines, and had zero interest in becoming some glamorous Hollywood personality. What he wanted was much simpler: a life. A real one. And in Lugano, he finally found it. He could just be himself, a husband, a father, a man enjoying quiet moments without the constant noise of fame. He could sit in a cafe, sip his coffee, and watch the world go by without a single interruption. He could take walks with his kids, laugh freely, and actually breathe without the shadow of a camera following his every move. It was a world away from the dusty trails of the Ponderosa Ranch. No lights, no scripts, no fake gunfights. That distance wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. It gave Dan the space to be who he really was. Because while millions of viewers saw him every Sunday night as the towering cowboy who stole their hearts, the real Dan Blocker was quietly building a far more meaningful legacy. He wasn't living as a star or a symbol. He was living as a devoted husband who adored his wife, a father who wanted his children to grow up grounded, and a kind, reflective man who valued peace over power. Switzerland gave him exactly that: serenity, simplicity, and a sense of home. And for Dan Blocker, that quiet, ordinary life meant more than any fame, fortune, or Hollywood glory ever could. The ending was as sudden as it was heartbreaking. The tragic death of Dan Blocker shocked everyone who loved him. In 1972, he returned to the United States to start filming what would become the final season of Bonanza. But something wasn't right. Those close to him noticed it immediately. The spark that had always defined him seemed dimmer. Dan felt weak, worn out, and strangely exhausted. The man who once seemed larger than life was suddenly struggling just to keep up. Concerned, he went to the hospital for a checkup, where doctors discovered that his gallbladder needed to be removed. It sounded simple enough, a routine procedure, nothing dangerous. A cholecystectomy was, and still is, one of the most common surgeries performed in America. Millions go through it every year without a problem. No one had any reason to think this would be any different. After everything Dan had survived, with the brutal war in Korea, years of grueling film schedules, countless stunts and injuries, this surgery felt minor, something he could easily bounce back from. And at first, everything went according to plan. The surgery went smoothly, and afterward, Dan finally felt that familiar pain in his side was gone. For the first time in ages, he was optimistic, ready to heal up, get back to work, and finish out the season strong. But only a few hours later, everything changed in an instant. Dan suddenly grew dizzy, weak, and complained of sharp, unbearable pain. Alarmed, his wife Dolphia rushed him back to the hospital. Doctors did everything they could, but it was too late. Later that same day, Dan Blocker, the gentle giant who had captured hearts across the world, passed away from a pulmonary embolism. Just like that, the world lost one of its kindest souls. The man who'd survived war, Hollywood, and fame itself was gone at only 43 years old, a heartbreaking reminder that even legends aren't indestructible. A blood clot had traveled straight to Dan Blocker's lungs, blocking a major artery. And just like that, the world lost one of its brightest lights. His death was sudden, unexpected, and absolutely devastating. One moment he was alive, laughing, planning for the future, and the next, he was gone. Dan Blocker was only 43 years old. The shock was instant and overwhelming. His wife, Dolphia, lost her life partner. Their 4 children lost a loving father. The Bonanza cast, especially Michael Landon and Lorne Greene, lost a brother in every sense of the word. The news shattered Hollywood and broke the hearts of millions of fans worldwide. People couldn't understand how someone who seemed so strong, so steady, so alive could vanish overnight. Right at the height of his career, right at the peak of his life. After Dan's death, Dolphia Blocker faced a life-changing crossroads. She could have stayed in the public eye, given interviews, written books, or even built a career from the fame of her late husband. But she didn't want any of that. She chose silence. She chose dignity. Dolphia stepped completely out of the spotlight, dedicating herself to raising their children, protecting their privacy, and preserving Dan's memory exactly as he deserved. With grace and respect. She never remarried. She never chased attention. She never tried to reshape the story. Instead, she lived quietly, just as she and Dan had always preferred, because Dolphia understood something the world often forgets. Peace matters more than publicity. As the years passed, she continued that quiet life, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, who carried forward the same values she and Dan had always lived by: kindness, humility, and heart. When her time came, she passed peacefully, leaving behind a legacy built not on fame, but on love. Dan and Dolphia Blocker's story wasn't just about Hollywood. It was about humanity. It was about living with heart, staying grounded, and never letting fame steal your peace. Their love and values live on through their family, and through every fan who still remembers that gentle giant from the Ponderosa. If Dan Blocker's story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and below, let's keep his memory and message of kindness alive.